Hello and welcome to the Health by Science workshop on plyometrics. Today we'll look at the theory of plyometrics. So first off, I guess good to cover what the difference is between generally explosive activities and what makes something plyometric. Just before we explain the difference and clarify what is and what is not plyometric, I guess a key component of what we'll look at today is power. So power essentially is our force times velocity. So it's exerting force, but exerting it quickly. Just a bit of, I guess, background and something that we'll refer back to throughout today. At the top on our y-axis, we've got our force production. So at the very top, we've got maximal force production. And then on our x-axis, we have velocity. So if we were to look at something like power, our peak power sits somewhere in the middle. There is always a power component because things are not static, we're always moving. So there is always a velocity component. And I guess what we'll look at today is how to influence peak power is one of the goals of what plyometrics does and what it does well. Because ultimately that in terms of sport and athleticism is obviously very important for change of direction, sprint speed, jumping, all these things, because we don't often have the time to produce our maximum strength. What maximum strength allows us to do is increase the capacity for power. But without a velocity component or emphasizing lower down on this curve, then we're unlikely to improve that power. So examples of what would be things like maximum strength would be, I guess, a traditional powerlifting exercises. So our big complex movements are generally going to be more of our maximum strength and how we would train and develop that. So 90 to 90%, 90 to 100% of 1RM. Again, this is a rough guide and it is a spectrum, but up the very top would be these kind of movements. They'd be some of the best tools that we could use. It is important to state that it's not just athletes. So when we are looking to improve power, there was a recent study that came out that had 583 participants. It was a meta-analysis, and what they looked at was power training and reported outcomes and performance tests on in older adults. So this is looking at is power training, I guess we would think of it as athletes and as sporting in a sporting context, because it is explosive, and the examples, running, sprinting, jumping, all these things are athletic. However, power is just suggesting that there is a velocity component there, and that is all relative. So somebody's older, yes, they might not be able to, to execute a long broad jump, but they can still train with intent and train with a velocity component. Some of the exercises included in this study were things like sit to stands and asking participants to get off the seat as quick as they can. They use things like wall press ups, but getting them to slowly bend the elbows and then explosively press off the wall. It's also they use things like low step ups, where they were getting them to drive up as quick as they can, so they were developing a power component. So although we see, I guess, power generally linking that to more things like strength, more things like athletes and sports, there is a big carryover to older adults as well, and we need that component within our training, because that is something that's one of the first things to go as we get older. So just going back to our curve here, so we've got our maximum strength at the top, we've got our strength speed underneath that. These are things like Olympic weightlifting movements, our snatch and our clean and jerk would fit in somewhere into that bracket. If you break them down, there's obviously different parts are slightly quicker, other parts are slower. Our peak power, like we spoke about at the start there, that would be things like our loaded jumps, bench throws, second pull. So that's the middle portion of a clean and jerk or snatch. That's one of the quickest movements in sport. And that would be a higher velocity component than the whole lift as a whole. We then have speed, strength, and maximum velocity. Now, the reason I've circled that is essentially where our plyometrics would sit. So a lot of stuff often gets covered within a gym program. If we have, even in a relatively beginner intermediate gym program, they're generally going to do some form of squatting, and they might have some slams, potentially some kettlebell swings. That sort of stuff would fit into to there. When we're getting down to the speed, strength, and maximum velocity, although things like slams might factor into that, we are looking more at plyometrics. So we've got our slower stretch shortening cycle, which we'll explain a bit later what exactly that means. Things like counter movement jump and box jump. And then down the very bottom, we've got our fastest movements, our fast stretch shortening cycle. So things like hopping and sprinting would come into that category. And that is essentially where plyometrics come into their own. That is where there's the box that we're trying to tick is down the bottom of this velocity curve. Now, that is not just for people that are looking to develop those qualities, but it has an impact on the curve as a whole. So if we just train in that maximum strength up the top, yes, we get stronger, but we're not able to access that strength any quicker. Going back to the example there of the older adults, if somebody is, say for example, in falls prevention, if somebody's about to fall, the correction of a fall is a very quick movement. So what we want is giving everybody the capacity to some degree that they can utilize their strength, but utilize it quickly when they need to. So explosive activities and plyometrics, they would both come into that bottom bracket there. And some of it is more semantics than anything else, but just for purposes of today, and so to help you differentiate what the differences are between them. That word explosive will get used. Ballistic is another one that also gets used. These are generally activities that have some form of like maximal intent. So many would involve a pure concentric focus, so things like a jump, but it wouldn't necessarily make them plyometric. And I'll explain why in a second. But these activities are great preparation for more plyometric activities, but we put these in the bracket of they are still trying to develop power, but the explosive or ballistic can't. An example, if you can get these to play. No, doesn't want to play. So an example would be this is the Korean national team. This is them doing some very, very big box jumps. So jumping from the ground up onto. So what qualities make an exercise plyometric? I would tend to encourage you to see it as a spectrum, as things are slightly more plyometric or less. But in general, these are going to be things that are impact driven. So there's an impact involved in it, and it's the intent to move explosively. So these typically incorporate a stretch shortening cycle. Now, one of the ways that we can think about that is this kind of elastic band analogy. So the faster that elastic band, you stretch an elastic band, then the greater the force obtained upon the resultant contraction. So if you pull an elastic band quickly, then there's more elastic energy, it's going to go further than a band if you pull to the same distance, but at a slower rate or you paused. So it's looking at that fast lengthening, that stretch shortening cycle, and making that as quick as explosive as you can. So the rate of the stretch is far more important than the magnitude of the stretch. So that is that elastic band. That's saying if you had two bands, they both stretch to the same magnitude, the same length, but one you pull really quickly, one you pull slower. That one that you pull quick is going to go further because it's got more resulting force. So explosive. So a key part of plyometrics is this pre-stretch, so the loading, that eccentric portion that stores energy in muscles and tendons, which initiates what we call the myotatic stretch reflex, which is what we're trying to tap into. The examples of these would be on all of these would be examples of that contact because we've got an impact on them. I'll play it in a second, but we've got that contact on the ground. We've got that impulse and impact on the ground on the left, double leg. In the middle, we've got a traveling version. On the right, we've got a split stance, so more emphasis on one side than the other. These all have an impact. They all have a fast stretch shortening cycle. So stretch shortening cycle, we've got that eccentric component, so that is the lengthening of the muscle. We've got this concentric, which is as you come back. That middle portion has a specific name within plyometrics. So we call this middle phase the amortization phase. bit of a wordy or a bit of a long name for that term, but it essentially is that middle portion. So between the eccentric is the concentric. So if you go back to elastic band, if we stretch that elastic band, but we then hold it and then release it, that's a very long amortization phase. Whereas what we want is that to be relatively quick. So there's a quick amortization phase. So there's an eccentric, which is pre-stretch or the loading phase, that stores energy in the muscles and tendon and initiates that stretch reflex. And the concentric is that shortening and rebound. The quicker we get that eccentric and amortization, then the more subsequent energy that we're going to have in that concentric. So stretch shortening contact times. So there's two broad brackets, and I'll give numbers as to what we'd classify as one or the other. Now, you're never going to, you'd have to be pretty incredible to know just by looking or listening exactly the meters per second, but we'll show some examples later where you can generally see things that are faster or hear things. Sound is definitely a friend with plyometrics. You can hear things that are quicker, harder contacts. In general, though, it's good to have these numbers because it helps us classify activities. So a lot of this work is done for us before. But if we said there's two broad categories, we've got short, which is our fast stretch shortening cycle. So these would be more plyometric in nature. So if we think of it as a spectrum, they're both plyometric, fast and slow, but fast is more plyometric in nature. There's more of an impact, more of an impulse. And then the second is our long, slow stretch shortening. I mean, these are still quick activities, but in terms of plyometrics, these are slower. In terms of the fast ones, generally anything under 200 milliseconds is deemed as fast, and anything over 250 is deemed as slow. And again, don't necessarily need to know those numbers, but that's just, I guess, how the activities we'll talk about later have been classified into this is more short and this is long. The reason it's important is when you're programming it, we don't want to just go straight into these fast contacts. We might want to do our longer, slower stuff first to set a base. So ground contact time is something that I mentioned there. So why does ground contact time matter? I guess first off, it's the time between your initial foot contact on an activity and the toe off for the same foot. Now, ground contact time, if we go back to those videos of the pogos and the hopping, that is the time we contact the ground to the time that we're off the ground. That is our ground contact time. If we're running, it's the stride of that. Say if you pick a leg, so it's the right foot as it contacts the ground, and then the time that it takes for that right foot from contact to when it goes toe off is the contact time. Now, to put that into perspective, if we look at within sport and within running, the ground contact times of runners, we see that with world-class sprinters, so Usain Bolt, I think he was about 86, around that kind of mark for meters per second when he set his record. That's how long his foot is in contact with the ground on when it strikes the ground. That is incredibly quick and it's incredibly fast to think just how much power he's managing to generate within that short space of time. And that is the difference between those kind of world class and then the sprinters. So that second one down, sprinters, sub 100 meters per second, that's fast, and then world class is even quicker. If you look at that with marathon runners, it's interesting to note that although we see it as a longer endurance-based sport, the ground contact times of elite marathon runners are much, much faster than amateur. Now, it makes sense, I guess, when you think about it, is that they're getting the same, if not, they're getting more force production, they get more power for less time. So their spring, their spring year, they're able to reabsorb or reproduce that force quicker over time. So that then feeds into things like running economy. So somebody who's able to have less leakage of energy through the rest of their frame, they're able to have these quick contact times, they're going to have better running economy. So even in endurance, this plays is an important role. So plyometrics can help leg spring stiffness. Now that is essentially, I'm talking about there with the marathon runners, when they're contact the ground, if that leg is loose and relaxed, then it's more likely that it's going to absorb and kill a lot of that energy. Whereas if we want it to be stiff and springy, that term stiffness is quite applicable here, because we want it to be stiff, so that if you imagine like a pogo stick, if you bounce on a pogo stick, it's not loose. If it's too loose, then it's more likely to absorb that energy, versus if it's stiff, we get those hard contacts, we get more of that force getting reproduced in the opposite direction. So as the foot contacts the ankle, the Achilles, everything is nice and stiff. Just some of the language or the phrases that we'll use, and just to help differentiate between what they are. A lot of them will get used interchangeably, a bit like we chatted about at the start, the explosive and plyometric in nature. Some of these terms, though, there is key differences, and we're just going to cover them now. So a jump, for the purposes of plyometrics, is thinking of a 2-leg takeoff and 2-leg landing. So stick landing, so sitting down is like 3 count landing. Okay, so on the left, we've got just a static single jump, and on the right, we have a double jump. Go back to there on the right, double jump. There are both forms of jumps. There is a 2-leg takeoff, there is a 2-leg landing. They would be forms of jumps. Now, there's many different things that can come into jumping. There's many different types of activities and exercises that would come in. An example of other things that would still come under the bracket of jump, but might look a bit more advanced. We've got these, so some multi-directional games of jump. So these are changing the direction, so that we've got forward, side, forward, but they're still forms of jump. There's still, each contact is double leg takeoff, double leg land. The second term we'll look at is what's called a bound. Now that is where we are, essentially, if you think of running, we're bounding from one leg, we're taking off on one leg, and we're landing on the opposite leg. So that would be forms of kind of running drills or sprinting drills would be forms of bounding. On the single leg camp, we also have what we'd refer to as a hop, which is if we do it on the same leg. So if bounding is bounding from one to the other, a hop is you're taking off and landing on the same leg. Examples of these is some simple, just diagonal hops in the landing. These are single leg takeoff, single leg landing, and it's the same leg, therefore we can get a hop. Key component in all of plyometrics that we'll look at is the catch component. Now, catch is really important, especially when you're introducing a new drill, or if somebody is a beginner. That is when we're looking at getting people to be able to absorb. We're working on the brakes before the gas. We're getting people to absorb that landing, so that we can then be able to coach in the future. We can then coach multiple jumps and things like that. That landing is super important, the ability to brace and withstand that impact before we then look at more complex tasks. So catch, essentially, that term is sticking a landing. So it's when you're emphasizing landing. When we're coaching, we'll say a lot of things like catch the landing. Now that is, obviously that reduces the amortization phase, and we'll talk about later why you would maybe want to do that, especially initially or when it's a new drill, and the benefits of that. But that would be, the aim on that would be to hold for roughly 3 seconds. Now, the reason for that is just that tells me that you're coming out of the movement because you want to, not because you have to. If it's a second, you might kind of wobble on the catch and then come out. Think of like a gymnast. Once they finish their routine, they have to catch their landings. They catch and stick the landing. They get points deducted if they don't. It's the same idea as if it was a 1 second stick, they'd all be fine. But you'll see the ones that maybe miss it, they'll land, and then that front, or one foot will move, and then they've not stuck it. Examples of sticking a drill. Stick the landing, so sitting down is like 3 count in the landing. You can hear me cueing stick the landing on those ones. So on there that we had, on the left was a jump, so kind of dropping off a step. On the second, there was a long jump. And then on the last one was going from one step onto another. But again, emphasizing sticking the landing on all those. Just going back to what I said there, the amortization phase on the stick obviously is increased, but we've still got fast amortization phase. We've still got that fast change on some of the drills. So on that middle one where we're doing the long jump, there's still a rapid eccentric, short amortization, then rapid concentric. So now what we'll do is have a look at, hopefully, a kind of useful tool in terms of taking a lot of the exercises and movements that can and are or can be plyometric. Not all of them will be in this, but they all feed into being to accessing higher intensity plyometrics. What we'll look at now is just a simple tool and kind of method that we use in terms of progression. So where would you start? So if you want somebody, you come away from this and go, brilliant, I'm going to get people doing some plyometrics, or if it's a return to activity, return to running protocol, whatever, what would be the kind of thought process? Because when it's done badly, that is when people jump up to the top of that pyramid too early. So there is a kind of process that we want to make sure we adhere to. There are many, before we go into this, there are many different kind of thought processes. This is, again, for myself, this isn't, pulled from different sources, but this is me trying to, I guess, kind of put something usable into action from what I've learned. So initially, the base of that pyramid, I think, cannot be overstated, how important these underpinning movements are. So before you start moving things quickly, we want to have a competency of movements at a slow pace so that we can move and access the proprioception, the coordination that's involved in that. Now, these would be activities just like squats, split squats, Romanian deadlifts, so hip hinging, some single leg balancing even would be underpinning movements. And then once we've established that, then we can increase the velocity. Now you can do them, as soon as somebody's demonstrated competency enough, then you can move on and you can do them both at the same time. I'm very versed to saying that, the previous teaching I'd heard was, you've got to be able to back squat X%, X times your body weight or whatever. I think as long as it's done sensibly and you adhere to the principles we'll go through, you can do them at or at most stages. But we just want to make sure that we've got some underpinning movements that we've got the capability to do that. And then it might be, once somebody's done they've demonstrated a competent squat, then it could be increasing the velocity. Spoke earlier about obviously older adults where they are doing maybe a sit to stand. That is a squat pattern. Yes, they might not be able to jump or leave the floor, but they can add velocity to that. So we've got the underpinning movements. The next thing we look at is the jump and landing skills. Now that is essentially us trying to work on those breaks, so we know that when we're going into different drills, we've got the ability to control the movements. And the emphasis on this would be on sticking the landing. These would be things like, it might be a sit to box or sit to jump. So you might have somebody seated and just get them to jump up. It could be box jumps in general. So jumping onto a stepper or onto a box. Standing long jumps, we've seen already in some of the videos there of just doing a static long jump or static vertical jump, or what's called a counter movement jump. The key things that we want to emphasize during this is our movement and coordination. So getting to grips with some of the basic movements and concepts that are going to help us when we move on higher up that ladder. If we progress too quickly, even if we're not necessarily getting injured or anything like that, when we carry on, we're just not going to get the most from it because we're not speaking the same language, and we're not, someone's not able to access the postures and positions that are going to help optimize their biomechanics and force production. So this is, I guess, this phase is just getting people used to, no matter what physical level they're at, is getting people used to the movements and being able to coordinate them. Again, focusing on the brakes first before the gas, and we want to drill what's called, we'll look at in a second, that athletic position. So basically the position at which we can produce the most power. So in terms of movement and coordination, again, these can be really simple drills, just generally any sort of drill that involves, sort of jumping. We've got skipping would definitely be one, is that we wouldn't necessarily, a lot of people don't think of it as plyometric, but it's 100% it is plyometric, and it's one that can help develop good movement, good coordination. A lot of these can be just unstructured, can be good fun, and can involve an element of coordination. In terms of characteristics, so we're looking at higher repetition because we want to learn the movements, and it's low intensity at this point. So things like skipping is, if you skip for a couple of minutes, then it's very low intensity. We're going to have a lot of contacts, a lot of repetitions, but the intensity is low in comparison. If you're doing a maximal, long jump, if you do 100 contacts on skipping, that's going to be pale in comparison to doing 100 max effort long jumps. Very different. So repetitions at this point are going to be quite high for that reason. Our landing and force production, so drills, examples of that we spoke about there, counter movement jumps, broad jumps, some hop and stick drills, box jumps, so jumping up and down onto objects as well. And we spoke about most of those. The landing technique we'll look at in a second. Characteristics of these would be low and slow. So again, you're building things up. You're not starting at a rapid position. You'd start with even if it's a vertical jump, you'd start counter movement jump, start slow, get the movement, and then build in the speed. So in terms of our landing or athletic position, and what we want to think of is if I was to ask anyone to jump as high as they can, generally it's not something that we would necessarily need to coach is the bottom position of that jump. So if you ask somebody to jump as high as they can, it's unlikely that they're going to drop, unless they've been coached a different way, it's unlikely they're going to drop into the bottom of a very deep squat and come back out. Your body knows that is slow and labored, whereas if the target is to go as high as you can, then generally it is a very intuitive self-selected depth. So when coaching this, I tend not to say too much. I just ask somebody to jump up and see what they do first before I give any pointers. So you see the angles there in terms of knee and hips. It is not a full squat, but that depth is kind of intuitive to the body. That is the optimal position that you can get the most elasticity from the muscles the quickest. So if we start going much deeper, so if this person here goes deeper into that squat, it becomes slower, we lose a lot of that elastic energy. So when we're coaching it, when we land, we want to be in that same position. Now, the reason for that is our best position to brace impact, but it also means if we're doing drills in the future where, in a sporting context, if we're going to change direction, if we enter, for example, a side step, we want the joint angles to be similar to this because that is the most powerful position. So we want to get in the habit of being in that position to make the next movement quicker as well. So next on our pyramid, we have reactive strength endurance. Now, I've said reactive strength endurance just because I want to emphasize that the repetition would generally still be higher because the intensity is going to be lower. So before we start going into the low repetition and the high intensity stuff, we want to make sure that we've got a base of these activities. Now, the reactive component just refers to what we spoke about at the start, is those contacts. So there's multiple contacts and they're quick. So although this is our low intensity Stretch-Shortening Cycle, it's still quick contacts. In comparison to you just standing and jumping, we've now got contacts. So in a static jump or a box jump, our feet start flat on the ground, we jump off the ground. There is a contact when we land, but we're not going into another jump, so we don't need to reproduce that. Whereas the big difference with these reactive strength endurance is we're going to reproduce that. So things like skipping would be in it, but they would just be further down that pyramid just because they are lower. So they might have done skipping by this point, but this would be looking more at higher intensity than skipping. So it could be things like bounding, so where you're bounding from one leg to the other. If you're on a pitch or a court, you're going for distance, you're trying to cover, it'd be 5 or 10 steps for maximum distance. You're really trying to push the distance that you're able to cover. Key thing is there's active foot contact. So instead of that foot just landing and sticking it, we're now going into the next one. So there's an active foot contact. There's active plantar flexion on the ground as you contact. So that foot is not just static, it is pushing down towards the ground so that when it meets the ground, there's an active contraction so that it's stiffer. So we're going back to that kind of stiffness idea. And quick contacts would be the thing that we're thinking about on these. So, example of these would be things like our pogos. We've got our traveling pogos on the left, and then we've got split stance pogos on the right. See with these are going to be harder contact than we've had with skipping, so it's a lot higher on here because there's harder contacts. But the principle is very much the same. These are reactive plyometrics. In terms of progression, and this is something that we'll talk later on about as a whole, is how you progress. But in general, what we want to look at is going from bilateral in place, so that would be standing still and doing our hops. So we call them pogo jumps that we had in the last video. Moving to unilateral in place, so that would be jumping up and down doing single leg or split stance. And then we've got our bilateral for height or for distance. So again, that's the intent element. So you're building an intent. And then the same for unilateral, you're going for height or distance. And then the final ones there are bilateral and unilateral continuous. So like the ones there in the video, we're now going continually. So we're moving, we're traveling as we're doing them, and we're doing them continuously. So next up, we have multiple jumps and hops, and these are high intensity. So we've taken the intensity up. We're now looking at continuous maximum effort now, long jumps, continuous hops, maximum effort bounding, or high intensity jumping, or hurdle jumps. I think would now come into this. So we've got, again, that active foot contact, active plantar flexion on the ground as we contact, the same as we did before, but with this big difference now, we've got quick contact, maximal jump height. So now the intent is built onto this now. So when we said at the start of that plyometric spectrum, this is now moving to things that are much more higher intensity plyometrics. So the next video will show you, again, just these would be moving towards more high. I'm not going to say that these are maximal intent, because I think you could definitely go higher. But just for the purpose of this video, we weren't particularly well trained at this point to go straight into them. Didn't want to risk injury, but it will hopefully give you a bit of an idea. So let's go 2 more. Nice. Okay, 1 more. On the left, we're dropping off a height, which is giving us more impact. And then we're going into a subsequent vertical jump. Still sticking the landing, again, because that is over by that point. We've finished the activity, but we want to still practice that base position. Nice. And on the left, we are traveling from one height onto another. Now, if we wanted to make things more intense on that left one, we would drop from a higher box. And if we wanted to make things more intense on the right, then we could use a higher box to land on. So there's more intention to go higher on that jump. Okay, let's go 2 more. So during this phase, we are looking at, we call it plyometric power there, but essentially our multiple jumps and hops. These would be things like drop jumps, high hurdles, distance hops. So you're now going for distance being the key part in that. We're looking at that stiffness, the rate of force development, quick ground contact times, quality as always, and intensity. So there's high eccentric force. So there's big impact, big landing. So if you're dropping off a height, there's a big eccentric load, eccentric force. We've got maximal effort, again, high stiffness. There's a high rate stretch-shortening cycle. And lower range of motion, I guess, because you're not dropping into deeper positions than maybe we did at the start where we're doing a sit to jump. At the top, and I've just put this in just to try and differentiate, because these are ones that I suppose I would just want everybody to make sure they use with caution. And for the most part, you could have, go back to hypertrophy, you could have, general population. If you train and you get somebody up to being able to do these kind of multiple jumps and hops, and you've got people doing some continuous long jumps, maybe some bounding, some box to box jumps, and some things like that. Brilliant. That's going to give people tap into that power component, get them doing it quicker. Brilliant. You get a lot of the benefits. But what I don't want to do is have people see the top of this pyramid the same as these, just because there is a bit more of a risk component, mainly because the intensity is higher. So we're talking about higher movements. So in this top, we have what I'd refer to as the shock method, which comes from uh, Verkhoshansky. So in the 1970s, he came up and popularized this type of training. Now, I've not heard people reference him as much as kind of old school Soviet bloc training, but this basically uses the kinetic energy of a falling weight, which increases a compulsory muscle tension. So you're using that. So you saw it in the last video there where we were doing, doing some drop jump and off it, and then into another exercise. Shot method is taking that and taking it a lot further. So this would be dropping off, one, even two, 1.5 meter boxes, dropping into those positions. And if I look on the two components on these ones are what's called like a depth jump and a drop jump. So we do have a video, I will attach it with this that doesn't want to play just now, between the difference between the two, but it's just be mindful that these are much higher intensity activities. These would be what I would call like the shock method. You're not going to do it, I don't do it personally with a lot of clients. There's only a handful over the years that I've used this with. If you work in a sporting context, it's definitely something that if you can get an athlete to that point, it will have an impact of benefit. And you might be much more likely to be up towards that because we don't work with kind of elite athletes in a sporting context. It's not something we've done a huge amount with people, but I would just exercise it with caution and make sure that we've got a good competency and good experience within all the levels below that. The other one that fits into shot methods, so we've got a depth jump and our drop jump, is what's called contrast training. Now, this one I would say is slightly more accessible, and in terms of the impact, you don't necessarily need to be dropping off, big boxes and that sort of stuff for this. And there's a lot of good research as well now coming into play with contrast training. So effectively, contrast training is taken generally below 85% of someone's 1 rep max on an exercise, and that tends to elicit the greatest acute potentiation and chronic adaptations. Now, potentiation is essentially that stored, almost kind of neuro energy that is then going into a plyometric activity. So the general thought process is if you do a submaximal strength exercise, like a squat, and then you do a biomechanically similar exercise after a rest period that is plyometric in nature, then there's an improved effect on that second exercise. So strong and experienced athletes, they can generally tolerate shorter intra-contrast rest periods, so less than kind of 5 minutes. However, weak athletes require longer periods to overcome the effects of the fatigue. So if you are using contrast training, you might want to rest longer if you're less experienced, and shorter if you are more experienced. But that might be things like pairing a squat. You might do sets of, say, 4 or 5 reps with 80 or less than 85%, and then going into taking a few minutes to recover, and then going into something like some broad jumps or vertical jump or a drop jump, and that would be our contrast training. So just to kind of finish up in terms of the principles of progression and our general rules around plyometrics, easy way I kind of find is start simple, move to complex. So if you start with an activity, start with the landing, start with the static jumps, and then move to traveling. So no matter how many times no matter what level somebody's at, when you introduce a new drill, it's always good practice to scale it. So start with part of it and then build onto it. So the video at the start where we saw one of our clients doing the hops where they had the hurdles, they were going all different directions. To start with, we just did one hop over. We then got used to that. We then did the transition to the side, back, and then built on top of it. So we start simple and then complex. So that goes for programming, but it also goes when you're coaching and introducing these. We start low impact demands, then move to high impact. We can always make a box higher or the height higher. We can always go a bit further or set the target further. So start low, get the movement, get the coordination first, and then build in high impact. Start double leg, obviously for obvious reasons, and terminate sets when the quality of contact deteriorates. So if you're in there in person, you can do that. You can call it. So when you're